How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin. Today I want to bring along with me to talk about the new ZV-E1 camera by Sony. So let's jump right into it. So finally, Sony released a new camera that is meant for the more vlogging content creator friendly because of the size and the specs that it delivers. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pricing and specs first, and then I'll give you a little bit more of my thought process when it comes down to the camera, and hopefully it'll help you out in the decision to see if this is a camera for you. First things first, this camera comes at $2,200 for just the body. If you want to get it with the lens that it comes with, which is I think a 28-60, it comes at about $2,500. That way you can kind of know the pricing point when it comes down to if you just want the body or with a lens that it comes with. This camera is basically a baby Sony A7S III when it comes down to the specs. It shoots 4K 120 all the way through at 10-bit color as well as full HD at 240 frames per second. Now that's pretty crazy to see that with a small package of a camera because, well, that's unreal specs when it comes down to a ZV kind of style camera when it comes down to full frame. This is a full frame camera with 12 megapixels, so you know it's going to be really good with low light, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking about like it being a baby Sony A7S III. It basically has almost the same specs as this camera, has a 5-axis steady shot in body stabilization, as well as 15 plus dynamic stops of range. So that's a pretty cool setup already for $2,200. You can also shoot S-Log3, S-Cinetone, and also put your custom LUTs. One thing that the Sony A7S III doesn't have is to be able to put your custom LUTs, which, to be honest, if Sony would do the upgrades of, you know, like with the software and firmware updates, you probably could already put that into this, but I've done a video about that already. Another thing that the camera has, it has an internal microphone, but you can also do your mic input jacks, which is cool if you want to have a smaller setup to use the actual microphone that the camera has, since it's not horrible from what I've seen, but you know, it's always nice to have that ability to connect your own microphone as well to make sure that you have the best sound possible, because no matter how good your video camera is, if the sound sucks, nobody's going to want to stick around to see it. So those are all the main specs that I think are pretty great when it comes down to the ZV-E1, and all for $2,200. To me, that's quite unreal. When it comes down to comparing it to the Sony A7S III, this camera is $3,500 and the FX3, which is basically the cinematic line of this camera, is $3,800. For $2,200 with all those specs, it's crazy what opportunities you can have as a content creator as well as just a person who wants to develop their skills further and don't have the budget quite just yet. But now let's talk a little bit about the downside and, you know, the comparison with the Sony A7S III to the ZV-E1. You're not going to get a lot of the customization buttons that the Sony A7S III has. We have the ability to have the C1s all the way to the C4 custom buttons, as well as being able to save our settings for, you know, the 1, 2, 3, where I have it as 4K 24 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and 60 frames per second. There's a reason why you're not going to be getting that is because of the form factor of the camera of the ZV-E1 is supposed to be more of a travel-friendly kind of type of content creator type of camera, comparing it to the ZV-E lines of cameras that they've had, which I thought were great. I just didn't really like the APS-C censored style because I have already lenses for full frame, don't want to have to be buying for both. Another thing is just a little bit of the button layouts. Instead of having this nice little wheel to be able to change your aperture, you're going to have to do it more into the wheel of itself of the camera, at least from the people that I've seen. Yes, you can customize it to some other different styles, but you're not going to have a lot of the buttons that you would have with a Sony A7S III, which depending on what you're trying to do, it could be a huge plus because it doesn't matter to you and you're getting some great specs for the price, or it could be a bummer because you need all of the nice, you know, customization buttons to be able to create the content that you need to. For example, for me, I love having the ability to have 1, 2, 3 right here for faster readout for video, so I can have it for 4K 24 frames, 120 frames per second in slow motion, my S and Q if I want to do some time lapses. So just a lot faster when it comes down to that, to be able to just go up and through, as well as changing my aperture quite fast. So for me, obviously the Sony A7S III has been great, but the ZV-E1 has been quite enticing to, if I may say so myself, when it comes down to possibly getting that as well. But now look at the comparison of the ZV-E1 as well with the FX30. I mean, FX30 comes in about $1,800 just for the body, and you have all the way 4K, 24, 60, and 120 frames per second, just like the Sony A7S III has. The downfall of it is that it's all in APS-C mode, and as well the low light capabilities compared to it is not the best because you don't have that nice ISO range that the Sony A7S III tends to have with, you know, that sensor sensor of a 12 megapixel, it allows it to have that nice low light capabilities. But when it comes down to the ZV-E1, for $2,200 in that kind of price range difference, it makes you question the idea that maybe you should go with a full frame sensor camera if you're wanting to have a little bit more dynamic range, a little bit more of that low light capabilities like the ZV-E1 now has for $2,200 versus the FX30 at $1,800. Despite the FX30 being more of a cinema line camera, it'll be interesting to see what people decide to go with, because personally, if I'm already diving into an A7 IV, for example, with the full frame lenses, I would prefer having a ZV-E1 to have full frame lenses with it, so that way I don't have to be buying for both sets. This FX30 would be a great camera if you're wanting to have a mix of, the APS-C mode, since the Sony A7 IV has APS-C on the 4K 60, so maybe you already have some of both. So it all depends on your wants and needs, but this is a pretty interesting thing that's going to happen to make a decision when it comes down to which camera is going to be best for you. I think this ZV-E1 is going to bring a lot of content creators that want to maybe dive into the full frame lineup without having to really fork over the cash over too much when it comes down to a full frame camera with unreal specs for video, because it's not going to be the best, obviously, when it comes down to photo. Even though I've used my Sony A7S III for photography, I've done a video about it, and it's still perfectly awesome with the 12 megapixels. But obviously, if you're diving into more like the content creator style of vlogging with the ZV-E1, you're going to want to have those video specs more than anything rather than photography. So the craziest thing to me is just that I was even thinking about how the Sony A7siii was a great form body factor just because it was full frame, but the specs were whatever. So now it's kind of like the Sony A7S III and the Sony A7siii had a little baby, and they call it the ZV-E1. It has about the same style of things where you only get one, memory card slot versus two, just kind of like the Sony A7siii. So that's one of the major drawbacks here and there depending on what you're wanting, but when there's some things that shortfall, there's a lot of things that take over for the price point. So I think it's still a great camera, which, to be honest, if I didn't already own my Sony A7S III, I would be heavily considering to get the ZV-E1 over maybe getting the FX30 or even getting two Sony A7 IVs, maybe have an A7 IV with a ZV-E1. And despite of that, I still am really enticed to get one because it would be nice to have this for more of the pro side of video where I need to have it, but have my ZV-E1 more for on the go to be lighter and quicker and faster to be able to take all the videos that I need, especially with less kind of attention to me. So I don't know. I'm really up in the air right now, but I'm definitely considering it. Put myself to be notified when stock is alerted to possibly order it right as soon as possible to get it, to test it out as well and make some cool videos for it for you guys. So now I want to get into who could this camera be for. This camera is a great camera to get into if you want to dive into more on the full frame side. If you're coming from an APS-C sensor camera and you're not ready there yet to maybe invest in an A7S III or FX3 when it comes down to that full frame lineup of cameras with the great budgets and customization that the bodies will have compared to the ZV-E1. It'll be a great camera that also will be if you're wanting to just get a camera that's good for content creation for like vlogging and want to up your quality when it comes down to the full frame like 4K 24 all the way to 120 at 10-bit color, because it gives you more range to be able to color grade a lot better and dive yourself into learning more about it, even if you're not there yet comparatively that if you would spend $3,500 on an A7S III. So for me, $2,200 sounds a lot more doable than, $3,500, $3,800 with a A7S III or FX3. So I think that's going to be a good ground point for a lot of people that are trying to get more into video to try to get better at it and future-proofing themselves when it comes down to having the ZV-E1 as their maybe first full-frame camera for video or anything like that. This camera, despite maybe you not feeling ready for it because of the specs of it, is still going to future-proof you for quite a while to have all those great specs for the price point that you have, and that way you don't have to really wait out to get that Sony A7S III if your budget really doesn't allow it. You're allowed to get that camera and other type of lenses. So I think this is going to be a great, structure point to get the people that want to have a good full frame, small, mirrorless camera like the Sony, like ZV-E1 versus having to maybe just get a Sony A7 IV and then an FX30 or something. So it's going to be quite enticing to see what people will go with. But I mean, me personally, I think if I wanted to become a vlogger and content creator more for video, the ZV-E1 would be a steal for $2,200 for what it comes with, for the form factor that it has, especially if I'm not 100%, let's say, video centered just yet, but I want to dive into it more. And as I learn, I'm future-proofing myself to not have to go and invest into another system or another camera and have to spend that money all over again and do the selling and trading of gear all the time. So That's just my honest opinion when it comes down to that. But that's pretty much all I have when it comes down to the ZV-E1. I think it's going to be a great camera, and going forward, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Sony A7S line of cameras. Are they going to change up to something different for the form factor? Are they going to go and stick more with the FX style of body for when it comes down to, you know, more of the cinematic kind of style of cameras with customization? Like instead of a Sony A7S III, they'll have an FX4 or kind of FX 3.2, whatever they want to go with. It's going to be rather interesting to see what's going to happen with the Sony A7S III line of cameras, because the ZV-E1 is a baby A7S III with the body of like the ZV line of the cameras with the specs of the A7S III. So it's going to be kind of wild to me to see what happens, but I'm curious to know what's going to happen with the Sony A7S lines and what other cameras that Sony are going to bring out. Now, the ultimate question is, would you be interested in this camera? Is it something that's for you, or are you really just going to pass it up and go for something else? Let me know down below your thoughts and which one you would go with if you're not going to go with this camera. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.